All right, we are ready when you are.
Wait, I gotta get my timer out. Alright, so today I'll be presenting to you the controversy, history, and the advancement of Tommy John surgery, specifically in baseball. So, a brief overview. So a brief overview of the human body and just how it moves. So the basic structure of the body is the skeletal system. And I'll be focusing, like I said, more on the elbow today. And so in your elbow you do have tendons, which connects your muscle to bones. Then you have your ligaments, which are typically around joints, and that connects your bone to bone. So, I don't know if you can see right here, the number 12 is the ulnar collateral ligament, which is the one that I'll be focusing on today. And in there, it is number 12. So even though it does look like a rather small piece of the elbow, it causes some pretty large problems for these major league pitchers. And then, so any movement you do put stress on your tendons and your ligaments. So say you're carrying in groceries for your mom and you're trying to make them all in one trip, then that does put stress. But obviously throwing a baseball, and as you'll see, the throwing motion is pretty unnatural. So throwing a baseball will put a lot more stress than carrying in an armful of groceries. But still, your arm does need time to recover, which is the big problem. You'll see later is that your muscle breaks down, and then as it heals, it repairs itself. But if you don't give it time to heal, it's not going to repair itself. So a brief history of the UCL injury. The ulnar collateral ligament, which I'll refer to as the UCL if you haven't picked up on already, it's occurred throughout the history of baseball and just other sports in general. And although it is most common in pitchers, any player could get it because baseball throwing is unnatural. And that's due to the intense and unnatural throwing motions. So baseball and pitching is all overhand, which is an unnatural movement for the arm. It puts a lot of stress on the joints. So basically what's going to happen is you throw and then you lead with your elbow. And as you'll see in a video I have later, the elbow does get stretched pretty far. So you're pitching and you come up and you throw like that, which is unnatural. That's why guys can't throw that much. But softball, they throw underhand, which is a more natural movement, which is why a softball pitcher can pitch every game and you can ride the back of that pitcher. And it can occur in starting pitchers, relieving pitchers, and closing pitchers. So there are a lot of causes, such as the number of pitches, which would mainly attribute to your starting pitchers, because they'll throw typically 80 to 100 pitches a game, because that's where they're most effective. But they do have to pace themselves, so they aren't going to go out there and blow their arm out in the first inning and then be ineffective for the next 5 or 6. Then you have relieving pitchers, who typically throw about 10 to 30 pitches, and their main purpose is to come in whenever you're up or down by about 3 runs, give or take. So if you're down by 3 runs, they'll keep you close so your offense can come back and hopefully win. But then if you're up by 3 runs, 0 to 3 runs, then they're going to hold that lead for you. And then closing pitchers, they're typically your guys that throw the hardest, which most closers in the MLB right now throw over 100 miles per hour. And most people haven't even driven at 100 miles per hour, so that's pretty quick coming to the plate. But they do have to exert the most force. And then they also do have to use the most intense breaking pitches, which whenever you throw like a curveball, you come through with that, but then you have to snap your arm forward, so then you get a lot of forward rotation on the ball, so then it breaks away from the batter, and then that's how you can kind of pull the batter there. So like I said, there are many causes, such as the number of pitches, which is your starters, pushing your body in general, which is more your relievers and closing pitchers, and then weighted balls, because even though this movement is stressful enough, a lot of people will use weighted baseballs, which essentially just to get their arm stronger. But since it's already an unnatural motion, any more weight on this could be detrimental to pitchers. And the first claimed UCL injury was in 1946 in a javelin thrower, which, if you picture somebody throwing a javelin, it's going to be about the same as throwing a baseball. But this was back, so they did diagnose this injury in 1946, but nothing was done about it. And then a nice little quote I found is that pitchers are seen as part boxer and part magician. So where this comes from is the part boxer is that they have to think ahead of all their moves. Like if a guy can't hit a curveball, they're only going to throw him curveballs and try and strike him out. And then the part magician does go back to the breaking pitches, which does put even more stress on the arm, because some guys, they can throw some pretty wild breaking pitches. So some of the pre-surgery days, Back before there was any surgery or any form, pitchers were kind of like an expendable on teams. You just kind of had a pitcher and then you used him until he was no good anymore. And that brings me to the first point, which is this injury used to end a pitcher's career. And it was just chalked up as the generic dead arm, which is what happened in the case of Sandy Koufax here. He was actually the youngest person to ever be inducted in the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. So as you may guess, he was a pretty good pitcher. And he had elbow problems himself, but back in these days it was never looked into. And it was just chalked up as a generic dead arm, so he was just out of baseball. And typically a lot of these players did work on a farm before they came to the major leagues. So after your arm was no good anymore, you just kind of went back to your farm. But then if you were only playing for about a year or two and blew up your arm, then you had to go get another job because you probably weren't financially stable enough to not do anything anymore. So it was just kind of, they had to either go back to the farm and pretend like they never played, or they had to get a new job. So the very first surgery was on a pitcher that's name is Tommy John, which is where the surgery name comes from, if you could guess. And he just wouldn't accept the generic dead arm personally, because he just wanted to keep pitching. Like he thought that his purpose here was to pitch in the major league, so he pitched in the major league. So he was traveling all around and making different contacts with people just to try and find medical help and answers. So in the surgery, he met up with a guy that was by the name of Frank Jobe, who did end up performing the surgery for Tommy John in 1974. And at this point, it was either the surgery works and he continues to pitch in the MLB, the surgery doesn't work, so he has to go back to the farm anyway, or he goes back to the farm if he doesn't get the surgery because he can't throw a baseball anymore. But luckily for Tommy John, this did end up successful, and as you can see, he returned in 1976 and pitched until he was 46 in 1989, which, as you'll see later, about 1 to 2 years is a typical recovery for these pitchers. So this one is about like the arm action, and as I was kind of trying to demonstrate. So as you can see, his arm right there is almost parallel to the ground, and that's solely based on the force that he's generated from his legs and his core, because whenever you pitch, you start from the bottom up, which I'll talk about, and then your arm essentially comes through as a whip, which that's kind of hard to demonstrate without putting all the force in, and it's very fast. So this is slow motion and his arm is still moving pretty quick. So you can just imagine the stress that's being put on his elbow regardless. And then I do have a 3D reconstruction of the surgery on a left-handed pitcher such as Tommy John was.
The ulnar collateral ligament, or UCL, is an important ligament in the elbow for baseball pitchers, football quarterbacks, and javelin throwers. When the UCL tears, the athlete often complains of pain on the inside of the elbow and a loss of velocity and control. The surgery for this injury involves a replacement of the ligament with a tendon graft. The most common sources for tendon grafts include the palmaris longus tendon from the forearm and the gracilis tendon from the leg. This UCL reconstruction is commonly termed the Tommy John procedure, named after the pitcher who was the first successful recipient of this surgery. In this animation, we'll show the UCL surgery with a gracilis tendon graft in a left-handed baseball pitcher. To get started, let's check out the anatomy. The humerus is the upper arm bone, whose bottom helps delineate the elbow joint. The radius and ulna are the two forearm bones that form the border of the elbow joint from below. The yellow arrow is pointing to an attached UCL. When a motion is forceful enough, or enough repetitive injury has occurred, this ligament can tear away from the ulna or humerus, often resulting in reconstruction surgery. In this case, we'll use the gracilis tendon, which is one of the hamstring tendons utilized for ACL surgery. This ligament is folded over to form a two-stranded graft that goes through a small metallic button that will serve as a flip anchor later in the surgery. Oftentimes, a surgeon will draw on the arm, noting where the incision will be made and to avoid the ulnar nerve, which is identified with a dashed line. In this simulation, we'll assume the UCL is torn away from the humerus. Next, the surgeon will make a hole in the ulna to accept the graft, using a pin first and then a reamer. The reamer is the same diameter as the graft and creates a hole for the graft. Now, the surgeon will pass a suture through the socket and out the other side of the arm. This allows the surgeon to pull the graft into the correct place. Now the sutures follow and come out the other side of the arm. We can then pass the tendon graft into the socket, which will happen after the metal button that you see there is flipped on the other side of the ulna. The surgeon then pulls on it to know that it's taut and secure. Then the surgeon will stitch the remaining graft strands so the graft can be passed into the humeral socket. This is how the graft will look when stitched. Now the surgeon will create a socket in the humerus, again using a guide pin and reamer as you see here. Now we have to make sure we have a way to anchor the grafts, so it's necessary to make 2 small drill holes. A tool called a suture passer is used to move the graft into the socket after it goes through the drill holes. This process is used for both holes. Now the surgeon will wedge the graft into the socket using a screw to create a tight fit. This is done with the elbow slightly flexed and in a neutral position. Finally, the surgeon will apply tension to the sutures and tie them together. The result is a ligament that is nice and taut. Over the last 30 years, this surgery has been performed numerous times, and frequently with very good results. A high-level motivated athlete can often return to throwing within a year, but it can take longer to attain previous levels of velocity and control. Immersion meeting.
So now I'm going to talk about the more financial side of surgery. So I found an example that was from this year, 2019 specifically. So there's a pitcher, he goes by the name of Michael Fulmer, pitches for the Detroit Tigers. I have a nice little picture of him there. As you can see, he's a pretty big guy, but this little tendon's causing problems, or ligament's causing problems for him. So he does need Tommy John surgery, as you may guess. But in Major League Baseball, all players' salaries are guaranteed. So he's on a $2.8 million contract this year, but due to this surgery, he won't be pitching at all this year, but he'll still get the $2.8 million. And players are insured privately by the team, so the surgery won't cost him a dime at all for the surgery. Because being an MLB pitcher is his job, so it's like he got hurt on the workplace, so there's all kinds of insurance and everything. And so typically, as you heard, you need about a year recovery. So he will miss 2019 and then possibly some of the 2020 season, depending on how he recovers personally, because everybody's different. And so the surgery cost will depend on the surgeon and the hospital. And that's the same with every surgery. Anytime you go for any doctors, it depends on the hospital and then the doctor you go to. So it is estimated this will cost about $38,076, but the team will only pay for $10,255 of it because of that insurance and how all that's covered. But the Detroit Tigers are worth $277 million, so getting this guy back and pitching and earning his $2.8 million, that's kind of pennies and dimes to them. So some about the post-surgery. So like I said, it's typically about a 1 to 2 year recovery period depending on the player. And then there is physical therapy after, which is more of a movement circuit. So as you can see here, right after the surgery, they have this big incision, as you saw in the video as well, and then they're putting a brace, which is like a no movement brace, or one of the ones where you can set the degrees for how far you can move your arm. And that's because your body needs time to accept the new ligament in your arm and accept the surgery itself and start its recovery process on its own. So this is typically about 4 to 6 weeks of no movement in your arm at all. And then whenever you come back and you get your cast off, or you get your brace off, or you get the movement range increased, you'll go to a physical therapist and they'll move your arm around. So a lot of them is just kind of like a movement circuit, testing all your joints, making sure that everything's still working the way it should. testing for pain, all of that. But the problem that comes with this is that these players have had elbow pain for so long that whenever they get their brace off and everything and they're ready to start throwing again, their elbow feels so good that they don't realize that this 4 to 6 weeks of no throwing and no lifting, anything like that, that your muscle deteriorates everywhere. So that's where the big problem arises, that a lot of these guys will start throwing again, but since they're not conditioned to where they were, they will injure their shoulder just because their shoulder is a lot weaker, but they're trying to push it because their elbow feels better. And that kind of ties in where it's an overall loss of strength in arm, so that's just kind of if you don't use it, you lose it type situation. And then you'll start from a light throwing and then work your way up to a full throwing. So the light throwing, I read that they start at 15 throws a day from 45 feet. But the Major League mound is 60 feet and 6 inches, so they're not even throwing from the distance that they have been paid to throw from. So they're really working from the bottom up. So some of the technology in the recovery is more of a, just from what I know, there is online training, so you can send an online trainer your height, weight, and then whatever else he wants to know, like how hard you throw. And you can train that way, he'll write you a program. And that goes the same with therapy, is that because the surgery is happening more frequently, these guys will have their programs already written down. So if you want to go to a therapist or you want to try and meet with a therapist that is highly renounced, but you don't have the resources because he lives in California, he can send you an online therapy program. And that's more for the younger kids that will get this. But, I mean, Major League Baseball players will meet in person because that is their job and their team needs them back. And they also just have the money and the ability to just fly these therapists wherever. So, some of the statistics about Tommy John surgery. There's an article from 2014 that said 179 pitchers in the league had or were undergoing Tommy John surgery. And if you think about it, that's about 3.5 times the size of our senior class, and which is just a crazy number. So about 83% of these pitchers did return to pitch in the MLB, which is even crazier to me, that these guys just had their arms cut open and they have a tendon pulled from, or a ligament pulled from somewhere else on their body and put into their elbow, and then they're pitching at the same level they were before. And what's even crazier is that 97% of the recipients returned to either the MLB or minor league affiliates. So minor league affiliates, just a little brief on that just to see, is that they pull players into their minor league teams, which is kind of like a farm system they call it, so they can watch them. So if somebody gets hurt up in the major leagues, they can call their next best up, which happened on the Pirates this year, that their shortstop got hurt, so they had to call up a guy from the minor leagues, and he's been doing well so far, so sometimes that's all you need. And then pitchers that had surgery returned with a lower losing percentage, fewer walks, gave up fewer runs, hits, and home runs, which is, I'll get to where a lot of the controversy comes back, because they're coming back better than they ever were before. So an example of this is by the guy named Eric Bedard. So he was born in Canada, grew up in Canada, and he didn't play high school baseball in Canada. So he wasn't pitching in high school baseball. He was cut from his 17-year-old and 18-year-old travel team. So he wasn't throwing there either. And he walked on at a junior college in Connecticut, but his arm wasn't trained because he wasn't pitching at all. And so he pretty much went in cold. The only throwing he was doing was in his family's barn with his brother, which was obviously not a crazy system there. But they said that his fastball kind of got crazy in junior college, so he was drafted in Major League Baseball in 1999. And he made his debut in 2002, which as you can see here, he pitched in 2 games right there. But in 2002, he did have to undergo Tommy John surgery, which we can only assume is due to the lack of throwing and then the immediate volume of throwing. Because if he went to one of the top throwers at his junior college, he's going to be throwing a lot more than in his family's barn. So he did recover, luckily, and he came back and was very dominant. So as you can see here, kind of like what I brought up before, how these pitchers are better, The first year he came back, he had 121 strikeouts, then 125, then 171, then 221. So as you can see, and then he didn't even pitch his most innings whenever he had his most strikeouts. So that's just a prime example of this guy just coming back and being even more dominant. I mean, he was a good pitcher, he was naturally gifted before, but as you can see, his numbers just climbed. And then his walks went down, home runs. Can't say the same for that. He gave up his most in his final year, probably because he was throwing his hardest that he ever has. So the scary part about this whole thing is that it's impacting younger and younger people. So this used to be just a surgery for these major league players that were just throwing insanely hard. But the one problem is, I looked up in the article about the youth because I heard about younger kids getting it, that kids now play on multiple teams and almost year round. So for example, you have a high school season, which is about March to May, late May, early June, whatever. Then you have summer ball that starts up, which is the entire 3 months of summer. And then some programs have a fall baseball team just to get in your last games before the winter. And then some schools have lifting programs and leg throwing programs over the winter, or you can go to pitching lessons over the winter. So you're playing for these 9 months outside, and then you should be taking these 3 months of the off season just to get stronger everywhere else, like your legs, whatever you lost during the season. But these kids are going to pitching lessons, so there's non-stop throwing, which is just constant strain on the arm, which is detrimental. And then, like I said, there are baseball-specific lifting programs, which is another thing that these kids are getting put on, especially by like bigger high schools. And so they're exerting more force than their arm can handle. As you know, as a teenager, you're still developing and everything, but if your legs and your core are getting super strong, then your arm's not going to be able to handle the force that you're outputting. So, and then like I said, nowadays kids are more susceptible to a UCL injury just because of the constant throwing and no breaks, no off season for you to recover. And then partial tears are possible, and these are more common in younger players than older players. So, according to a doctor that specializes in UCL surgery, goes by the name of Dr. Bradley, a partial UCL tear is typically healed with 6 weeks of no throwing, followed by a rehabilitation program. So the 6 weeks of no throwing is solely for the purpose of your arm recovering itself, recovering this partial tear, and then the rehabilitation program will be similar to the ones that the major league pitchers go through, where they'll start with the movements and then slowly get back into throwing, because if you don't throw for 6 weeks, you're going to lose muscle once again. But that's because kids, they'll typically have inefficient throwing motions, so they'll try to throw all arm, which is a lot more stressful on the arm than if you would have used your legs and your core, which I have a video of here. This pitcher's named Aroldis Chapman. He's known as one of the hardest throwers in the MLB. So he's thrown upwards of 106 miles per hour. So this is a video of him just watching his legs and his core and see how his arm really just kind of locks behind and comes through as a whip, more or less. So as you can see, his legs and his core were already set on going to the plate and delivering his pitch, and then the arm came through, which gave him that whip, which gives you a lot more velocity on your fastball. But luckily for younger kids, it is a lot easier to fix a younger kid's motion just because they haven't been doing it that long, so it's not that much of muscle memory yet, which is the problem with a lot of the older players, that if they do have an inefficient motion, they've just been doing it for so long that it's just muscle memory and they can't really break that. So another doctor that goes by the name of Dr. Andrews said that surgery is often looked at as the last resort by these doctors. But the problem arises with this is that some kids are just set on getting it, and so they won't go through the 6 weeks of no throwing. They'll be throwing for that 6 weeks and they won't take their program seriously. And then So they just operate anyway, just because the kid's dead set on it. But the kids most likely see the benefits of the surgery, so then they want it. So onto the controversy and the advancements. So some of the controversy, like I already brought up, are the pitchers coming back stronger? So as I said, they give up fewer, their winning percentage is better, they give up fewer hits, runs, and home runs, and as you saw in Eric Bedard's case, his strikeouts skyrocketed. So that's one of the controversies, that are these players just coming back stronger? And then another problem is that these younger kids are getting this surgery. So, and you never want a younger kid to get hurt or be injured, be down with the surgery, whatever, which is another part of the problem. And then I kind of put the part about it being a necessary evil in there, because these major league pitchers are getting their surgery and they're coming back so much stronger that if you're not naturally gifted with this, is it almost necessary that you need this surgery just to stay competitive in that situation? Which, that's almost along the lines of a performance enhancing system there, because it's almost a necessary thing just to keep up with the competition. And then, so it doesn't really benefit society at all unless you are a pitcher that has the surgery and you still want to continue pitching, then you can come back, and that's a way that enables you to come back and throw. Or if you watch baseball and you like to see guys throwing 100+ miles per hour, then that's your thing too. And then, so another thing is that nobody really wants a pitcher's career to end based on this injury. Like, everybody wants the best for everybody, and so that's another part of that. So some of the advancement is that, the first part of the advancement is that the recovery processes that come after the surgery are just crazy. How fast they can get a guy, his arm was just cut open a year ago and now he's pitching at the same level he was before. And then another part of the advancement pre-surgery is the fact that they can test whether you have like a partial tear or the fully torn UCL based on a series of movements. So it'll be a lot like the physical therapy side of movements, and that's just because, so they narrow it down so you do one movement, and if you have elbow pain where your UCL is, they're going to have a list of options of what could be wrong. Then you do another one, then they check off some options, and they eventually narrow it down, and then they can make a decision without even cutting your arm open and looking at your UCL. So the main advancement with the surgery is how little time it takes now. So because of the fact that it is so commonplace now, it's just that it's like a wisdom teeth surgery. Like, I had mine done and I was in and out in half an hour, which is just crazy that these surgeons are just so used to doing this that they get a guy in, cut him open, get all their stuff. It's just kind of like mindless to them now. So the surgery does take less than an hour. And then, like I already said about the movement test that will test for the injury. And then another part of it is it can be diagnosed on the spot due to those tests. And then despite the first surgery being in 1974, it really didn't become popular and more advanced until the late 1990s, because that's whenever the real boom with it was, that these guys were starting to get the surgery left and right, so then they could just get them in and get them out and get them throwing again, because that's what these major league teams needed from them. So why did I choose this topic? I chose this topic mainly because I play baseball and I'm no stranger to arm soreness, just from pitching, because I've pitched for since I was 10, so I'm no stranger to it. And I already knew about it, just from following baseball from a young age. I've seen that injury reports come up that this pitcher's gone down with Tommy John surgery, this guy needs Tommy John surgery, this guy's recovering from it. I never really knew what it was, so I looked it up and I already kind of had a background on it. But I wanted to know more about it, and then I also heard about the younger kids getting the surgery, which was just crazy to me that these kids don't know their limits. Like, you could have a future in the game of baseball, but you're going to push yourself for some stubborn summer coach that is just going to try and use you for wins. And that's a picture of me pitching right there. Probably struck that guy out. So, my opinion on this. So before, like I said, I knew about it, and I knew that it was necessary for people to get. Even though it is a surgery, it's necessary for the pitchers to come back and get, or for the pitchers to come back. It is a necessary surgery. Which, I mean, that's just the way it goes, basically. So after research and everything, I thought it was crazy how the teens got it, but I understand why, because you're playing on multiple summer teams, so you could go out, pitch in the morning, and then come back and then play the outfield in the afternoon, and you just threw 100-some pitches, so your arm is already going to be shot, but then you're needed on your other team, and that's due to the year-round. And I really thought it was eye-opening, just for me personally. And I say this because I played spring, summer, and fall baseball, so based on that resume, I would have been a candidate for the surgery. I mean, thank God I'm not, but just based on that, yeah, knock on wood. But just based upon that, I would have been a candidate, so it kind of hit home for me. And I have my